The 9,195th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is maintenance of peace and security of Ukraine. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representatives of Estonia, Poland, Slovakia, and Ukraine to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo, Under-Secretary General for Political and Peace-Building Affairs, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I also invite His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations, to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of Item 2 of the agenda. I now give the floor to Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo.
Mr. President, in the past few days, Ukrainians have been subjected to some of the most intense bombardments of the 9-month-old war. Russian missiles and drones have rained down on Kyiv, Mykolaiv, Chernihiv, Cherkasy, Zhytomyr, Sumy, Kharkiv, Lviv, Poltava, and elsewhere, destroying or damaging homes and severely disrupting critical services. The impact of such attacks can only worsen during the coming winter months. As of 14 November, the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights has recorded 16,631 civilian casualties, 6,557 persons killed, and 10,074 injured since the start of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The recent barrages will, alas, add to the horrific toll the war has already taken. I must say it again. Attacks targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure are prohibited under international humanitarian law. The military dynamics on the ground continue to evolve. In the past week, the city of Kherson returned to Ukrainian government control. Heavy battles also continue in Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Indeed, there is no end in sight to the war. As long as it continues, the risks of potentially catastrophic spillover remain all too real. Yesterday's incident in Poland near the Ukrainian border was a frightening reminder of the absolute need to prevent any further escalation. I wish to join the Secretary General in extending condolences to the families of the 2 Polish citizens killed in the incident. Mr. President, the ongoing bombardment of Ukraine has already damaged an estimated 40% of the country's power generation capacity. Kyiv has been hit hardest. Most parts of the capital are now without electricity for 12 hours a day. As the Ukrainian government focuses on repairing damaged infrastructure, the United Nations has made it a priority to ensure that the most vulnerable receive winter supplies and services. More than 185,000 people have already received essential basic winter supplies. Humanitarian partners are setting up heating points near the front lines. Some 525 generators were provided or are being distributed to priority institutions, including hospitals, collective centers, and clinics. Humanitarian access has resumed in the areas back under Ukrainian government control, including in Kherson. However, it is still extremely difficult to reach people in need in areas of the east and south under the control of the Russian military and across the front line. Mine contamination, particularly in areas close to the front or where control has recently shifted, are putting more lives at risk. impeding the movement of civilians and hampering humanitarian efforts. I remind the parties that international humanitarian law requires them to facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for all civilians in need. Mr. President, the allegations of atrocities and human rights violations in Ukraine during this war are extensive. Today, I'd like to highlight grave concerns about the rights, safety, and security of the youngest Ukrainians. Over 400 children have been killed, and many more have been injured, lost their family members, or been forced to leave their homes. According to the government portal, Children of War, 279 children were considered missing as of 12 November. There are also disturbing reports of forced transfers of children, including of some under institutionalized care, to Russian-occupied territory or to the Russian Federation. OHCHR has documented several individual cases, including of unaccompanied children, that appear to amount to deportations to the Russian Federation in violation of international humanitarian law. OHCHR also continues to document other types of human rights violations, including 57 verified cases of conflict-related sexual violence. 48 of these cases are attributable to Russian armed forces and affiliated groups. 9 are attributable to Ukrainian armed forces and law enforcement authorities. The Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine continues its work towards accountability for alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law, with ongoing investigations in and out of Ukraine. The commissioners are planning another visit to Ukraine before the end of the year. Another issue of concern is the conditions of prisoners of war. I welcome the continued prisoner exchanges between Russia and Ukraine, including most recently on 11 November. I encourage the sides to continue releasing POWs. I call on the parties to ensure humane treatment of prisoners of war in line with their obligations under international law, in particular, the Third Geneva Convention. I also call on the Russian Federation to grant OHCHR and ICRC unimpeded access to detainees. Mr. President, the extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative remains vital to help avert a food crisis for millions of people. More than 10 million metric tons of foodstuffs have now been moved under the initiative, reaching or on their way to some 40 countries. The impact of the initiative extends far beyond immediate ports of arrival, helping to lower global food prices for key food commodities around the world. The Secretary General has continued his engagement with all parties in support of the renewal and full implementation of the initiative. He has also emphasized his commitment to removing remaining obstacles to Russian food and fertilizer exports. These products are not under international sanctions, but suffer indirect impacts. It is important and critical to get them back to world markets. The sooner, the better. Mr. President, the risk of nuclear incident in the context of the open hostilities in Ukraine remains an unacceptable danger, and I wish to echo the serious concerns expressed by numerous member states in this regard. The IAEA Director General has recently briefed this Council on the organization's latest efforts, including ongoing discussions regarding the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, as well as assessments of activities and materials at other sites in Ukraine. The IAEA has reported that, in the coming weeks, it will send nuclear safety and security missions to 3 more operating nuclear power plants, as well as to Chernobyl at the request of the Ukrainian government. I reiterate the imperative to avoid any military activity that could risk compromising the safety and security of any nuclear facility. Mr. President, since before the invasion of 24 February, the United Nations and many others in the global community warned of the consequences of a wider war in Ukraine, for Ukrainians, first of all, but also for much of the world. These fears have amply borne out. One significant casualty of the war has been the international collective security system we have all pledged to uphold. The damage to the structures built to resolve or manage tensions and conflict is significant, making it, in turn, even more difficult to chart a path out of the hostilities in Ukraine. There is only one way to stop the death, destruction, and division. The war must end, and it must end in line with international law and the UN Charter as called for by the UN General Assembly. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. DiCarlo for her briefing. And I give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Undersecretary General DiCarlo, for your valuable briefing today. Colleagues, I want to start by noting the tragic explosion that killed 2 people in Poland near the Ukrainian border. We extend our deepest condolences to the loved ones of those Polish citizens who were killed. As President Biden told President Duda last night, we stand with Poland in this difficult moment and have offered our full support for and assistance with Poland's investigation to determine exactly what happened. We have complete confidence in the Polish government's investigation and appreciate the calm, careful, and measured response. While we still don't know all the facts, we do know one thing. This tragedy would never have happened but for Russia's needless invasion of Ukraine and its recent missile assaults against Ukraine's civilian infrastructure. The UN Charter is clear. Ukraine has every right to defend itself against this barrage. Defend its sovereignty, defend its territorial integrity. The more than 90 missiles that rained down on Kyiv and other targets in Ukraine have devastated civilian infrastructure. In fact, this may have been the widest scale missile attack since the beginning of the war. Now millions of Ukrainians are without heat or electricity. We extend our solidarity to the Ukrainian people for the fallout of this attack and our deepest condolences for those lives lost. This is a deliberate tactic by Putin. He seems to have decided that if he can't seize Ukraine by force, he will try to freeze the country into submission. It is hard to overstate how horrific these attacks are. When I was in Ukraine last week, I saw firsthand the tremendous suffering these kinds of attacks and this war has wrought on the Ukrainian people and Europe more broadly. I know we've all seen the photos of cratered playgrounds, bombed out hospitals, and destroyed homes across Ukraine. But no photograph can capture the real lives affected, the real people suffering the immense human toll of Russia's war against a fellow UN member state. I felt that toll when I spoke with a mother in Kyiv who had to hold her daughter's lifeless bloody hand after a Russian attack on her apartment building. Her daughter, in her mother's words, just wanted to go to school. I felt that toll when I met with a humanitarian aid worker who was detained and tortured by Russian forces. She was so traumatized that she could only share a portion of the horrors she experienced, unable to put the rest into words. I felt that toll when I met a 10-year-old named Melina, who lived in a facility where displaced families were gathered to prepare for a bitterly cold winter, a facility which itself had once been hit and damaged by Russian missiles. I was there to announce more humanitarian funding from the United States to provide supplies and support while Russia prepared to weaponize the winter. I made that announcement in the dark during a blackout caused by Russian attacks. Afterwards, I asked Melina what she would do when the war was over. And I could tell that this was something that she had given some thought to. She said simply, she wanted to see her best friend, who she had not seen since the start of the war. And I have to say, I wondered if she would someday see her friend again. Colleagues, when I met with President Zelensky, his message was simple. He seeks peace. He told me he seeks a just peace that is based on the UN Charter and its principles, which is what everyone in this council is here to uphold and defend. We cannot say the same for Russia. As Secretary Blinken has told this council, if Russia stops fighting this war today, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. It is Ukrainian civilians who are in danger. It is Ukrainian civilians whose electricity grids have been targeted, who aren't sure how they will keep warm throughout the winter. It is Ukrainian civilians who are suffering. There's one man sitting comfortably in Moscow who can put a stop to this brutal, horrific war right now, this second. But until he does, we must address not only the scale of the humanitarian and human rights crisis unfolding in Ukraine, but also the continued spillover effects of this needless war. Just look at the outsized harm done by Russia's exacerbation of the global food security crisis. Colleagues, if you're looking for a practical way to lower tensions and help those in need, it would be by supporting and securing an extension of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. According to the UN's records, nearly 500 ships carrying over 10 million metric tons of grain and other food items have departed under this initiative. That's enough to feed tens of millions of people. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has helped stabilize food markets, with reports that prices have fallen to pre-war levels. 2/3 of the wheat exported under the initiative has gone to the global south, but the deadline for renewing the deal is fast approaching. When I was in Kyiv, I visited a granary and heard that farmers need this deal to be extended so they will have the confidence to plant their wheat and continue serving as a breadbasket to the developing world. I could hear the desperation in their voices, and I promised them that I would take their message back to the Security Council. Russia must extend this essential life-saving arrangement. Russia must allow these ships to keep feeding the world. And I call on our fellow council members to make the same calls with the same urgency to keep the deal alive. In the long run, the only way to ensure food supplies are not impacted further is for Russia to withdraw its troops, stop the atrocities, and end the war. But in the meantime, we're grateful for the efforts of Turkey and the UN in sustaining and expanding this life-saving initiative. And I hope sincerely that we can continue to strive with Ukraine in the driver's seat toward a just and lasting peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, USG DiCarlo, for your comprehensive update. Here we are with another meeting on Ukraine, and yet after 9 months of brutal war, we continue to deplore loss of innocent life, countless unnecessary fatalities, widespread human misery, massive destruction, food insecurity, and a world order shaken to its core. In a normal life, 9 months is the period humans need to bring a baby to life. Russia has used it to make a disaster of terrible proportions, including by making normal life impossible to all, including to babies born in Ukraine since the 24th of February. For what reason? For a dream that has turned into a nightmare, for a miscalculation that has become an obsession. Mr. President, what some have feared and others had anticipated happened yesterday. A missile landed in a farm in Poland, killing 2 people. It landed roughly at the same time as a barrage of Russian missiles attacked western Ukraine. A full investigation is underway, and we look forward to its conclusions. But this does not change anything to the core issue. For as long as this war goes, we will run the risk of spillover by accident or intention. This incident should be a stark reminder that those who engage in the path of unnecessary reckless escalation will bear the consequences. We know, and the world knows, that consequences of the war are not limited to Ukraine only. Moldova has already complained about the effect of Russian missiles fired close to its borders, and parts of its territory are experiencing power outages as a result of Russian missiles hitting Ukrainian cities and vital infrastructure. We present our condolences to the families of the victims and to the people of Poland and Ukraine. We reiterate our full and unwavering solidarity with Poland, just as with every other NATO member. Let's make it clear, this is not a war between Russia and NATO, nor is it between Russia and the West. It has never been, despite Kremlin's propaganda to justify its debacle. It is and remains a war of choice, a pure act of unprovoked aggression and an attempt to grab territory. This war must end, not expand. And Russia started it, Russia must put an end to it, and this is long time past due. Mr. President, yesterday, President Zelensky proposed a 10-point peace plan at the G20 summit in Indonesia, demonstrating leadership again by making clear he is prepared for diplomacy to end the unjust and unjustified war. The plan includes a path to nuclear safety, food security, a special tribunal for war crimes, and a final peace treaty with Russia. The staggering response was, alas but not surprising, another wave of missiles, its biggest in a month, targeting again residential areas and power infrastructure in several regions of the country, with the aim to destroy essential utilities such as electricity, water, and gas infrastructure across Ukraine. As the winter gets colder, more than 7 million Ukrainians are left without power and the supply of electricity in a critical condition. In this case, there was no error. It looks like more terror. Unable to prevail on the ground, Russia has decided to weaponize everything, including weather now, with the intention to freeze an entire nation to submission. But it seems they fail to understand that in this fight, Ukraine has nothing more to lose. The heroic resistance of brave Ukrainians has clearly made it impossible for Russia to win, unable to advance, and incomprehensible to acclaim. Mr. President, Russia decided to withdraw its troops from Kherson. It was not the first of such sudden reversals. They did so early this year from the surroundings of Kyiv. No one, including in Russia, is buying anymore the camouflaged language. The so-called special operation cannot conceal the fiasco, and the retreat cannot hide the defeat. Only a few weeks ago, on 30 September, Kremlin proclaimed Kherson to be Russian forever. Now, a few weeks later, it just turned to what it should be, never. A wiser decision would be for Russia to come to senses, cease all hostilities, and unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine. And let me reiterate once more that any annexation of territory by another state resulting from the threat or use of force is a violation of the principles of the UN Charter and international law and will not be accepted. Mr. President, the Russian Federation continues to violate and blatantly ignore international law. USG Di Carlo mentioned some key aspects of these violations. The use of missiles, drones, explosive weapons in populated areas are prohibited by international law, including by binding resolutions of this Council that Russia has voted for. Violations of human rights and international humanitarian law, enforced disappearance and arbitrary detention of civilians, torture and ill treatment of both civilians and prisoners. Cases of conflict-related sexual violence have been widespread and now are well documented. These gross violations will not go unpunished. Victims and their family members seek justice and accountability. Russia may continue to block the Council, but as we have seen repeatedly and convincingly, including last Monday, they will not manage to veto the decisions by the UNGA and other initiatives to seek and ensure reparations and accountability. Mr. President, we reiterate our strong support for the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We reiterate our call for its extension beyond 22nd November to keep this vital food supply line open to the rest of the world. Its impact is known and felt worldwide, And any other decision than extension would be a cynical punishment of those in dire need. Mr. President, let me conclude by reminding that the toll of the war is already frightening. With every day going on, the toll will be heavier for all, for Ukraine first, for everybody, including for Russia itself. In the course of the past 9 months, nothing has gone according to plan in Ukraine, for the simple reason that the Russian plan was wrong, the intention behind reprehensible, and the reality has proved disastrous. It's time to change course, silence the guns, pack and go home, talk peace, not war. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of France.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. President, while the G20 leaders were meeting to defend peace, Russia once again demonstrated its unscrupulousness by launching a new campaign of strikes against Ukrainian cities. It targeted civilian infrastructure in so doing. France condemns in the strongest terms these strikes, which constitute flagrant violations of international law. We reaffirm our support for Ukraine. Moreover, I convey France's solidarity with Poland and our condolences for the victims. These were conveyed yesterday by President Macron yesterday evening to the Polish Prime Minister. Russia alone shoulders the sole responsibility for this war. Its mass strikes against Ukraine which threaten international stability and security, and it is its strikes which may lead to involuntary escalation. Ukraine is quite simply exercising its absolute right to self-defense. With this aggression, Russia is deliberately violating the United Nations Charter, and namely the principle of Ukraine's territorial integrity. Since the 16th of March, the International Court of Justice has called for the suspension of Russia's military operations. Soon, 9 months of war will have elapsed, and attacks against civilians and civilian infrastructure continue. Russia is now targeting power stations and hydroelectric plants and heating networks, which are far behind the front line, with the apparent goal of breaking the resistance of a people who is fighting for its freedom. Because it is losing ground, Russia is looking to plunge Ukraine into cold and into darkness as winter draws near. This strategy is already a failure. It is in no way eroding the resistance of the Ukrainian people. On the contrary, this strategy is bolstering its determination. The liberation of Kherson is one more illustration of that fact. Mr. President, the more Russia digs its heels in to make this war last, the more it worsens the energy, food, and economic consequences of that war. In recent weeks, in this very chamber, we've heard Russia increase its outrageous accusations regarding the preparation of a dirty bomb by Ukraine. The inspections of the International Atomic Energy Agency, which were conducted in Kyiv, Zhovty, and Dnipro at the request of the Ukrainian authorities, revealed no undeclared activity or material. Now we have the confirmation that these allegations were entirely unfounded. France hails the speed with which the IAEA visited the sites in question, and we congratulate Ukraine for its transparency. Mr. President, Russia does not hesitate to instrumentalize food insecurity and malnutrition. The fate of millions of people depends upon the extension of the Istanbul Accords. After having first of all suspended for several days its participation in the Black Sea Grain Initiative, Russia is now looking to use its agreement to the renewal of those accords as a bargaining chip. This blackmail is unacceptable. Everything must be done so that the exportations of Ukrainian grain can continue without obstruction. We call upon Russia not to hinder the renewal of the 22nd of July accords. France will continue to support the efforts of the Secretary General and of Turkey in this regard. We will also continue to rally with our European partners as part of the Solidarity Lanes initiative. These Solidarity Lanes have allowed the exportation via waterways and over land of around 15 million tons of grains and other food products. I recall that the European Union, the United States and the United Kingdom on the 14th of November published guidelines aiming to facilitate the exportation of Russian fertilizers and food products. France announced a contribution to the tune of 7.5 million euros to facilitate the delivery by the World Food Programme of fertilizer to Africa. Mr. President, Russia will not be able to evade its responsibility for crimes committed in Ukraine. I welcome the adoption by the General Assembly of a resolution recommending the creation of a register to document the damage suffered by all Ukrainian victims. France hails the courage and resistance of the Ukrainian people. We will continue to stand by their side. France will organize jointly with Ukraine on the 13th of December a conference to support Ukraine. This conference will aim to meet the urgent needs on the ground and will increase the supply of international aid, whether we're talking here about essential material or the reconstruction of critical infrastructure, in particular of energy infrastructure. France reiterates its unwavering support for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine in the face of Russia's aggression. We remain determined to continue our support for Ukraine's efforts to defend its territory and will do so as long as is necessary. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Under Secretary General Di Carlo, for your briefing. I'd like to start by offering our sympathies and condolences to the Polish people and to the families of those injured and killed in yesterday's incident. While we await the outcome of the investigation, we should be clear that this is a tragedy that indisputably stems from Russia's illegal and unjustified invasion and its inhumane assault on civilians across Ukraine. Yesterday, as President Zelensky was setting out to the G20 his 10-point plan for peace in Ukraine, Ukrainian civilians were facing the largest barrage of Russian missile and drone strikes since the first week of the war. We extend our condolences to the Ukrainian people and the families of those injured in these attacks. Russia's systematic attacks on Ukraine's critical national infrastructure have left millions without electricity, heating, water, medicine and food as temperatures start to drop below zero. And more than that, today we've heard again from the UN detailed reports of civilian deaths, sexual violence and forced deportation of children. Russia is knowingly trying to gain military advantage by creating desperation. Attacks of this kind may violate international humanitarian law and are in any event deeply inhumane. President, on Monday, the General Assembly adopted a resolution on an international mechanism for reparations for damage, loss and injury arising from Russia's internationally wrongful acts against Ukraine. This was an important first step towards justice for Ukraine. President, we are in no doubt that Ukraine will prevail in the face of Russia's aggression. The liberation of Kherson shows the strength, courage, and determination of the Ukrainian people to defend their right to sovereign equality and territorial integrity guaranteed under the UN Charter, and the UK will continue to stand by the Ukrainian people. But while the war is ongoing, we must continue also to manage its wider effects as best we can. That is why we strongly support the Black Sea Grain Initiative. It has been vital in helping alleviate the serious risks of food insecurity in the world, and we strongly support the UN in the efforts to renew it. President, fundamentally, this war is the result of unilateral action on the part of the Russian Federation. The path forward is therefore simple. Russia needs to cease hostilities, withdraw from within Ukraine's internationally recognized borders, and commit to a path of dialogue. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, the United Arab Emirates extends its heartfelt condolences to Poland for the 2 civilians killed in yesterday's incident. The news of missiles hitting Polish territory and the increases in strikes across Ukraine seem to signal the frightening escalation many of us have talked about in this very room. It perfectly demonstrated the fact that as the fighting continues, each day becomes a gamble in which there cannot be any winners. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine is a source of profound concern. With winter's onset, 40% of the country's power system is reportedly damaged and 30% of its power stations are destroyed, potentially compounding the humanitarian crisis with a lack of heating. Around the world, governments continue to warn of the war's consequences on the global food supply, most recently at the G20 summit in Indonesia. In addition to the export of grains, the supply of ammonia and fertilizers, which are crucial to ensure adequate crop yields for next year's harvest, are also a priority. As the Secretary General has said, we cannot let this year's crisis of affordability become next year's crisis of availability. We join the call to renew the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and we urge the stakeholders to reach a solution that ensures the extension of these agreements, a critical breakthrough for which we are grateful to the UN and Turkey. Similarly, we commend OCHA and the other humanitarian actors for their tireless efforts to provide Ukrainian civilians with essential supplies, including the recent convoys to southern Ukraine. As humanitarian assistance and efforts to renew the grain initiative continue, we must acknowledge that this is not enough. Only a sustainable and peaceful resolution of the war will put an end to the suffering it has caused. We are encouraged by the recent public statements discussing the contours of a possible peace agreement. This Council must play its part to support any efforts at talks, and we must focus on measures that can bring the sides together rather than further apart. Mr. President, last month marked the 60th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Back then, pragmatic and inventive diplomacy brought the world back from the brink. Public statements which counseled calm and restraint in response to the news from Poland and which emphasized the need to establish facts on the ground helped avoid further escalation within the last 24 hours. But the overall episode was an unnerving warning of the risks inherent in the continuation of the war. This cannot be the new normal. Too much is at stake, not least of which for Ukraine. We recall here the statement that came out of the G20. We must uphold international law and the multilateral system, defend the UN Charter, and adhere to international humanitarian law. Beginning with urgently needed de-escalation, we must encourage confidence-building measures and open channels of communication to end this conflict and to ensure that today's era is not an era of war. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Thank you, President. We're grateful to Undersecretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. The missiles that fell yesterday in Poland, independently of their origin or whether it was intentional or not, are a source of great concern. And we'd like to express our condolences to the families of the victims who died as a result of these unfortunate events. This incident reminds us that the risks of an expansion of this conflict are real, and they force us to increase our efforts to find a diplomatic solution quickly to put an end to the suffering of the civilian population in the entire region. I would like to refer to 4 points. First of all, I'd like to mention the humanitarian situation. In addition to the damage accumulated during the 9 months of the conflict, now we have the destruction of the electric infrastructure just as and the beginning of winter. The lack of electricity compromises many other basic services. I'll give an example, the supply of water. And all this, of course, puts at even greater risk the life and health of millions of civilians. If the deterioration of living conditions will continue, there will be a new wave of displacements at a time when host communities are already at the limit of their capacities. The figures are quite eloquent. 7.8 million Ukrainians have had to abandon their country, while another 6 million have become internally displaced. In this context, humanitarian assistance has become essential for the survival of especially the most vulnerable population. We'd like to reiterate our appeal to allow unrestricted access to all civilian population, including the areas, the occupied areas, the oblasts that are occupied, where martial law has been decreed. Now, although it's perhaps less obvious, the conflict has also had very severe consequences on the mental health of the population. The more than 400 children killed and some 270 disappeared are a very tragic demonstration of the pain that this war is causing. Mexico would like to reiterate how important it is to include psychosocial support services in the humanitarian response strategy. The consequences on mental health will not end when the conflict finishes, which is why it will be essential to develop a long-term strategy to deal with this dimension of the conflict. A dimension that is both silent and painful. Secondly, I'd like to mention the issue of nuclear safety and security. The situation around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant continues to be a source of great alarm. We'd like to reiterate the appeal to establish a protection and security zone around the plant, as has been proposed by the International Atomic Energy Agency. Mexico acknowledges the work of the IAEA, and in particular for the verification of the 3 sites on which one of the parties had some doubts regarding the activities that were taking place there. We'd like to take note of the fact that the agency concluded that there is no evidence of any nuclear activity or non-declared materials. We will continue to follow very tentatively the results of visits to the other 3 nuclear power plants, including Chernobyl, in the next few weeks. While there's no doubt that the situation in the Zaporizhzhia power plant is critical, it's also important to underscore that during a conflict such as this one, all nuclear facilities could become a disaster for the population and for the environment. Thirdly, I'd like to refer to the Black Sea Grain Initiative. This, as has been stated here, has been essential to help mitigating food insecurity that mainly affects developing countries. This is why it is essential that this initiative continue, and that the agreement signed to facilitate access to global markets of food products and fertilizers from Russia is fully implemented, including ammonium. We would like to recognize the efforts of the Secretary General to eliminate the huge amount of obstacles that the exports of these products have encountered. These agreements have been a sign of hope for those who believe in dialogue and in diplomacy as ways of reaching a solution to the conflict, in spite of the multiple disagreements that often appeared to be almost insurmountable. Lastly, Mr. President, I would like to mention that it is extremely important to make progress in international investigations to ensure accountability. Those that have committed crimes in this conflict must be brought to justice. The international community owes this, at least this, to the victims and to their families. This is why we will continue to follow very attentively the work that the International Criminal Court is conducting on this point. In conclusion, I'd like to reiterate that Mexico would like to insist on the need to explore new formulas that would promote mediation and dialogue to put an end to this war. Mr. President, Mexico would like to reiterate its support to the sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Mexico for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Kenya.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Under Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing. And the briefing we have had today makes it clear that the war in Ukraine continues to cause extreme suffering to civilians far beyond what is acceptable under international law and international humanitarian law. We offer our condolences to all the families and communities that have lost loved ones to this war, including in the incident that happened yesterday in Poland. We pray for the speedy recovery of those injured and traumatized. We are gravely concerned by the persistent targeting of civilians and objects indispensable to their survival, including residential homes, health facilities, shelters, as well as energy and water infrastructure. This war that follows on a long-term political conflict is a violation of Ukraine's territorial integrity and constitutes a breach of the fundamental principles of the UN Charter. The military alliances forming on either side are giving the war a regional and global footprint. The risk of its escalation to the use of weapons of mass destruction suggests the ultimate inability of a clear military victory at a cost that is acceptable to humanity. There is no long-term military solution. All that a continuation of the war will do is delay negotiations while even greater damage is happening. Kenya, therefore, once again, calls for an immediate cessation of hostilities. Negotiations will not be easy, especially if they are to be fully in line with the UN Charter in protecting the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Ukraine. But they can succeed, as others have in Europe's volatile history. It will also be critical that they be accompanied or followed by a broader settlement that stabilizes what is now a profoundly compromised European security order. Mr. President, the world needs peace in Ukraine and in Europe. The humanitarian cost to the people of Ukraine are joined by those of millions around the world. We continue to applaud the humanitarian-inspired and UN-facilitated Black Sea Grain Initiative. We strongly urge for its renewal on permanent terms. The flow of grains and fertilizers from Ukraine over the Black Sea and also from the Russian Federation over the land corridors must be assured. Unfortunately, there are still unilateral blockages of food and fertilizer products despite the frequent assurances to the contrary. We therefore urge the Secretary General to urgently undertake an assessment of official and unofficial blockages and to make that report available to the Security Council. The same should be done by humanitarian organizations such as the World Food Programme. We also encourage regional organizations such as the European Union and the African Union to review and report on the experiences of their member states in ensuring unimpeded exports of Ukrainian and Russian food and fertilizer to world markets. Our region, the Horn of Africa, is experiencing the worst drought in decades. We cannot afford to pay for exceedingly expensive fertilizer if we are to avoid a worse food insecurity situation in the coming year. We must move from political assurances of the open flow of these vital goods and transparently and rigorously assess and report the facts on the ground. Millions of lives depend on this august house, going beyond rhetoric and guaranteeing practical effects. Mr. President, the crisis presents an opportunity. Africa is the most food insecure region in the world. Yet, it has the largest amount of underused arable land with a population that is still mostly rural-based. Too many African families use a disproportionate part of their incomes on purchasing food. It is a major component of the political instability that sadly leads to the continent having the most conflict situations being handled by the Security Council. We now have a historic opportunity to put in place financial risk mitigation, technology transfers and investments to transform agricultural productivity on the continent. While we commend the humanitarian efforts being made to offer relief, our target must be sufficient production. The efficacy of the continent's cooperation agreements with other regions and major powers should be judged by the extent to which they lead to a surge in Africa's production of food and fertilizer, so that it is never again as vulnerable as it is today. Mr. President, the more protracted this war is, the more its malign effects will spread. As more citizens suffer in more countries, their political demands may lead to less worldwide solidarity with the suffering people of Ukraine. Every country calling for this solidarity must look into its conduct when it comes to enabling the free flow of food and fertilizer products and act with compassion and empathy for those who need them around the world. In closing, Kenya once again reiterates its respect for the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and political independence of Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Kenya for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of India.
Mr. President, let me begin by thanking Under-Secretary General Rosemary DiCarlo for her briefing and update of the situation in Ukraine. India continues to remain concerned about the situation in Ukraine, including the targeting of civilian infrastructure and the death of civilians. Since the beginning of the conflict, India has consistently called for an immediate cessation of hostilities and for an end to the violence. We've called upon both sides to return to the path of diplomacy and dialogue and have also expressed our support for all diplomatic efforts to end the conflict. We thus stand ready to support all efforts aimed at de-escalation. India's Prime Minister has said unequivocally that this cannot be an era of war. We hope that the international community will continue to respond positively to the call for humanitarian assistance. India has so far dispatched 12 consignments of humanitarian aid to Ukraine and stands ready to do more. Mr. President, I will also state that the impact of the Ukraine conflict has not just been limited to Europe. The Global South is especially facing serious economic consequences. We are also seeing growing concerns on energy and food security from the conflict that follow the severe stress created by 2 years of the COVID pandemic.
Insofar as specific initiatives pertaining to issues like food, grains, and fertilizer shipments are concerned, we very much hope that the UN-facilitated Black Sea grain and fertilizer package deal will be renewed in coming days, and that this will be implemented by all parties earnestly in all its aspects. I wish to assure this Council, Mr. President, that India's approach to the Ukraine conflict will continue to be people-centric. We are providing both humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic support to some of our neighbors in the global south under economic distress. In closing, may I reiterate that the global order is anchored on the principles of the UN Charter, international law, and respect for the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of India for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank Ms. Rosemary DiCarlo for her enlightening briefing. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine will soon enter its 9th month, and it seems that there are no signs of a de-escalation or of a cessation of hostilities on the horizon. We hail the resumption of exports as part of the grain initiative following a brief suspension. The implementation of the agreement must be grounded in the firm and good faith commitment of all parties. Here I wish to echo the appeal issued by the Secretary General for the renewal of this important agreement and for its full and balanced implementation. The resumption of the grain initiative is a sign that even in times of war, the channels of dialogue and diplomacy remain open. Mr. President, the war in Ukraine continues to have many humanitarian consequences. These have prompted the mass displacement of people fleeing these sites of the fighting. These humanitarian consequences have also produced many civilian victims and many material losses, the cost of which are incalculable. Ongoing insecurity and the disruption of supply chains have plunged many people into hunger and distress. The primary victims are vulnerable persons, namely women and children. These people are often the victims of sexual violence, of trafficking in persons, and of manifold violations of their fundamental human rights. Once again, we call upon the warring parties to uphold international humanitarian law and to refrain from inflicting suffering on civilians. Civilian infrastructure, including civilian nuclear sites, must not be the target of attacks, and humanitarian aid must be delivered without impediment. My country reiterates that it opposes the use of any weapon of mass destruction. We call for dialogue and for negotiations in good faith in order to achieve a ceasefire. Gabon supports and will continue to support all efforts aiming to find a diplomatic solution able to guarantee the peaceful coexistence of all parties. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Gabon for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ireland.
Thank you, President, and thank you, USG DiCarlo, for your briefing. I also want to open by expressing our condolences to the Polish people following the explosion in the small border town of Przewodów yesterday, which killed 2 people. We extend our deepest sympathies to the families of those killed and injured. We also fully support Poland's investigation of the incident, and we stand in full solidarity with Poland. President, Russia has launched hundreds of drone and missile strikes in recent weeks in Ukraine with the apparent aim of terrorising and demoralising the civilian population. Yesterday, Russia scaled up its strikes with further attacks in Kyiv and across Ukraine. While Russia seeks to escalate the war, millions of people across Ukraine are tonight grappling with the prospect of a dark and freezing winter without reliable access to water, heat, electricity, and other basic services. The most vulnerable in Ukrainian society, the internally displaced, children, and the elderly, face a particularly precarious future. Women, already disproportionately impacted by the war, are once again put in unsafe and precarious situations. That this may be the intended result of recent Russian attacks on Ukraine's cities and infrastructure is simply unconscionable. This includes efforts to remove Zaporizhzhia from the Ukrainian grid and attacks on other Ukrainian nuclear facilities. This utter disregard for nuclear safety carries the strong risk of a nuclear incident with terrible consequences for Ukraine, Russia and the wider region. We stressed the importance of the 7 pillars of nuclear safety and security and their applicability in armed conflict, as set out by the IAEA Director General. We condemn these heinous attacks in the strongest possible terms. Attacks intentionally directed against civilians and civilian objects are war crimes, and those responsible for such attacks must be held to account. Mr. President, the people of Ukraine have shown remarkable resolve and determination in the face of brutal adversity. Ireland stands with them today, as always. We are very concerned by reports of heavy fighting in the east, where living conditions for the civilian population are increasingly dire, and where Russian forces continue to attack, particularly around the city of Bakhmut and other towns in the region. In the south, we cautiously welcome the liberation of the city of Kherson and note the decision of the Russian leadership to withdraw to the eastern bank of the Dnipro River. We recall that parties to the conflict must comply with international humanitarian law. This includes the prohibitions against indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks and the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack. There must also be full, safe and unhindered humanitarian access to civilians in need, including those who choose to remain or who are unable to leave. Those who seek to leave and those who are forced to leave must be allowed to do so safely and be allowed to leave for destinations of their own choosing. We note that thousands of civilians were reportedly evacuated by the Russian army before its withdrawal from Kherson. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians have been moved from Russian-occupied territories. We recall that the transfer or deportation of civilians by an occupying power from occupied territory can constitute a war crime. Refugees, internally displaced and stateless persons are particularly at risk of exploitation, with attacks and abductions that lead to trafficking. Women and children face particular danger in this regard and must be protected from harm. Conflict-related sexual violence is never acceptable and, again, may amount to war crimes. Mr. President, the reverberations of this war continue to be felt far beyond Ukraine's borders, with unequal and disproportionate impacts on developing countries. The Black Sea Grain Initiative plays an important role in alleviating global food insecurity, and it should continue to do so in the months ahead. We are grateful for the efforts of the UN and Turkey to facilitate Russia's resumed participation in the agreement. We urge all sides to maintain engagement in good faith and continue this important initiative. Mr. President, we have set out many of these concerns on many previous occasions at this table, and I fear we will do so again. But as my Minister for Foreign Affairs said earlier today, Ireland will make no apology for being on the side of international law, the UN Charter, and on the side of Ukraine and its people. Russia should end its illegal war of aggression, stop killing innocent civilians, and shelling of infrastructure with immediate effect. It is never too late for dialogue and diplomacy. We therefore renew our call on Russia to immediately cease hostilities, withdraw its forces, and commit to resolving all outstanding issues peacefully and in line with the UN Charter. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Ireland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank USG DiCarlo for her briefing. Brazil shares the concerns regarding the worsening humanitarian situation in Ukraine and the impact of the conflict on food security in other regions. Since the start of hostilities, we have advocated for the parties to engage in negotiations for a ceasefire and a peaceful solution to their differences. The Black Sea Initiative, which has already enabled exports of more than 10 million metric tons of grain, has been an important step. Brazil welcomes the decision of the Russian Federation to reconsider the suspension of its participation following the incidents of 29 October. While the conflict in Ukraine is not the only cause of the food insecurity we now face, the continuation of grain and fertilizer exports through Black Sea ports helps stabilize prices and prevent shortages. Fragilities in global food supply, however, stem from systemic actions over past decades that have hindered the development of the agricultural sector throughout the developing world, in particular in Africa. Among these, we must recognize the deleterious impact of massive agricultural subsidies and distorting tariff and non-tariff barriers that hold back agricultural production in developing countries. We renew our support for the mediation efforts of the Secretary-General and the Republic of Turkey. We encourage the parties to engage in the immediate extension of the grain initiative, which we see as a necessary decision and an important confidence-building measure. Mr. President, the approach of winter finds Ukrainian cities in an alarming situation. The destruction of civil infrastructure, particularly in the energy sector, exposes millions of families to life-threatening conditions. Brazil strongly condemns the attacks against residential areas and civilian facilities, for which there is no justification. We urge all parties to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian law and to adopt practical measures to minimize civilian injuries and damages on the ground. At this challenging time, the international community needs to stand together in humanitarian assistance to Ukraine. Since March, contributions of food and medical supplies have been shipped from our country to Ukraine. In the coming weeks, Brazil will send 24 additional tons of rice donated by the private sector. The Brazilian government has also simplified entry requirements in order to facilitate the reception of refugees. It is encouraging to see that this wave of solidarity is observed in dozens of countries. We urge governments and the private sector to engage in similar initiatives which have never been more urgent since the beginning of the conflict. Mr. President, finally, we renew the call for the parties to return to the negotiating table without delay. We encourage other members to explore ways to foster dialogue. There is no more urgent task facing the United Nations than the search for an immediate ceasefire without preconditions. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Brazil for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the Ukraine crisis is getting increasingly protracted, expanded, and complex, putting further stress on the current tense international situation and bringing greater uncertainty to the world, which is not in the interest of any party. No matter how many difficulties and challenges there are, the international community should strive to seek consensus, find room for cooperation, and play a constructive and responsible role in promoting the de-escalation of the situation, restarting diplomatic negotiations as soon as possible, and mitigating the spillover effects of the crisis. In the current context, China believes that the international community should continue to make efforts along the following directions. First, we should work jointly to support the peaceful resolution of the crisis. A conflict or war has no winners. Dialogue and negotiations are the only viable way out of the Ukraine crisis. As long as negotiation starts, there is hope for peace. China knows that Russia has expressed its willingness to engage in dialogue on many occasions in recent days and hopes that the parties concerned will move in the same direction, respond positively, and start direct engagement as soon as possible to create conditions for restarting negotiations. There are no simple solutions to complex issues. On the basis of accommodating each other's legitimate security concerns, parties should explore the construction of a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture so as to fundamentally address the security deficit behind the crisis and achieve peace and stability on the European continent. It is our hope that the United States, NATO, and Russia will conduct comprehensive dialogues on this matter. China will continue to play a constructive role in its own way. About the Meteor report, the landing of a missile in the eastern village of Poland and resulting in casualties, China calls on all relevant parties to keep calm and exercise restraint to avoid misunderstanding and miscalculation to avoid the further escalation of the situation. Second, we should work jointly to prevent nuclear risks. Nuclear safety, security, and safeguards bear on public health and environmental safety in Ukraine and neighboring regions. There is no room for trial and error in this regard. All parties concerned should exercise restraint, act prudently, strictly abide by the Convention on Nuclear Safety and other international law, ensure the safety of nuclear facilities and material in Ukraine, and do their utmost to avoid any possible nuclear risks. China supports the IAEA in fulfilling its functions in accordance with its mandate and playing an active role with regard to nuclear safety. China has always maintained that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. We have noted the recent statement issued by Russia reaffirming the relevant elements of the January joint statement of the leaders of the 5 nuclear weapon states on preventing nuclear war and avoiding arms races. The international community should work together to maintain global strategic stability, make every effort to avoid confrontation between major powers, advocate that nuclear weapons must never be used and a nuclear war must never be fought, and prevent a nuclear crisis in Asia and Europe. Third, we should work together to improve the humanitarian situation. China is deeply concerned about the continued deterioration of humanitarian situation in Ukraine and relates deeply to the difficulties experienced by the people of Ukraine and the neighboring regions. We call on parties concerned to earnestly abide by international humanitarian law, make every effort to avoid attacks targeting civilians and civilian facilities, minimize civilian casualties and the impact on people's basic livelihoods, and prevent to the maximum possible larger-scale humanitarian crisis. This winter will be very hard for the affected population in the countries concerned and the neighboring regions. The international community and the humanitarian agencies should continue to scale up relief efforts to help alleviate humanitarian pressure and improve humanitarian situation in Ukraine and neighboring regions, and ensure that all refugees, displaced persons, and other people in need can be properly resettled and safely survive the winter. Fourth, we should work together to mitigate the spillover effects of the crisis. The Black Sea Grain Initiative has made a positive contribution to alleviating the global food crisis. China welcomes the efforts by all parties to adhere to the humanitarian principles and focus on the overall situation by resuming the implementation of the initiative, and calls on all parties to maintain cooperation and dialogue in order to reach a proper solution on the extension of the initiative. China supports the UN Secretary-General and his team in continuing to play a coordinating role in resolving the difficulties in Russian food and fertilizer exports. We call on the relevant parties to take robust measures to eliminate the negative impact of sanctions. Managing properly the huge impact of the Ukraine crisis on global energy, food, finance, and other fields is a pressing task for the international community. Sweeping and indiscriminate sanctions disrupt the global industrial and supply chains, undermine the momentum of global economic recovery, and damage the economic and financial stability of developing countries. Immediate actions must be taken to rectify this approach. Mr. President, the world is undergoing momentous changes unseen in a century. The Ukraine crisis and its spillover effects, as an epitome of the changes, highlight the major challenges facing human development. What is wrong with the world, and what should we do about it? This is the question of our times to all countries. At the just concluded G20 summit, President Xi Jinping, with deep insight on the future of humanity and from a historical and global perspective, put forward a series of initiatives and propositions which are of great significance for guiding the efforts to address the current global challenges. China calls on all countries to embrace the vision of a community with a shared future for mankind and advocate peace, development, and win-win cooperation. All countries should replace division with unity, confrontation with cooperation, and exclusion with inclusiveness. All countries should join hands together to tide over difficulties and create a better future. China firmly opposes drawing ideological lines, Cold War mentality, group politics, and bloc confrontation. China rejects beggar-thy-neighbor practices and practices of building a small yard with high fences or creating closed and exclusive clubs. China also opposes the attempt to politicize economic and livelihood issues or use them as tools and weapons. China stands ready to work with the rest of the world and continue to make relentless efforts to address global challenges and build a community with a shared future for mankind. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President. USG DiCarlo, thank you for your very useful briefing. Yesterday, the Russian army inflicted massive waves of missile strikes on Ukraine, with civilians being killed. And in Poland, we saw an explosion resulting in the tragic loss of Polish lives. We are in close contact with our allies and partners and support the ongoing investigation. What we do know, however, is that this would not have happened had it not been for Russia's illegal war on Ukraine. One only needs to look at Kherson to see further evidence of their brutal campaign against civilians. We see in the wake of Russia's forced retreat, atrocities and destruction. They did what they could to make the situation as difficult as possible for the civilian population, destroying water, heat and electricity supplies. And they continue these tactics across the country. With winter approaching, the number of casualties and displaced persons could accelerate. Children, the elderly, and other people in highly vulnerable situations are particularly at risk. We call for safe, rapid, and unimpeded access for humanitarian organizations to all people in need, including access to prisoners of war. We commend the UN, International Committee of the Red Cross, and other humanitarian organizations for staying and delivering a principled humanitarian response under very challenging circumstances, and also the courageous and committed Ukrainian responders. We reiterate also our demand that all civilians must be protected. International humanitarian law and international human rights law must be fully respected and implemented. International law applies to all nations. It is not optional. President, the suffering and the atrocity committed by Russian armed forces have shocked the whole world. The consequences are felt globally. Russia's war of aggression is causing a refugee tragedy with a regional impact and is destabilizing financial markets, supply chains, and disrupting global energy security. The world's most vulnerable people and countries depend on a steady supply of food from Ukraine and Russia to global markets. It is essential to keep a transportation line open for the exports of grain, related foodstuff, and fertilizers, including ammonia. Considering the dire global consequences, we trust the parties will stay committed to the Black Sea grain deal and that these life-saving shipments will continue. President, Russia's war of aggression demonstrates their disregard for the core principles of our organization and the suffering of millions of people in the wake of this war. As members of the Security Council, it is our duty to set a different course. As the Secretary General has emphasized, we have the values and principles necessary to chart this course. They are already enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations. When the time comes, we will stand firmly with the Secretary General in efforts to build and sustain peace in Ukraine. We will work actively to ensure that this Council remains vigilant of the situation in Ukraine and able to address the host of other conflicts on its agenda. Let me end by repeating something we have said numerous times before, and yet it cannot be said often enough. Through its aggression and actions, the Russian Federation is acting with blatant disregard to international law. Russia must immediately heed the ruling of the ICJ and the calls of these United Nations to suspend its military operation within Ukraine's internationally recognized border and stop the senseless bloodshed and global suffering. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for their statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we're very grateful to our Albanian and American colleagues for the initiative of conducting today's meeting. It's true that they requested it last week without even stating the topic of the meeting. And in that, as we now see, they demonstrated remarkable farsightedness. If this meeting had not been scheduled, we would have had to convene it to discuss the attempts by Ukraine and Poland to provoke a direct clash between Russia and NATO. Now, the completely irresponsible statements made by the leaders of these two countries cannot be interpreted any other way. For example, the statement by Mr. Zelensky, and I quote, "We must put the terrorist in his place. The more Russia feels its impunity, the greater the threat for anyone who is within the range of Russian missiles." A missile strike on the territory of NATO is a Russian missile strike against collective security. This is a very serious escalation. We must act, and end of quote. Then he expressed condolences to Poland in connection with the people killed as a result of the Russian missile attack, while stating, and I'm quoting, "Russia kills anywhere where it can reach," end of quote. Now, I would like to draw the attention of colleagues. These are statements made by a man who cannot fail to have access to information that it was Ukrainian missiles that crossed into Polish territory launched by Ukrainian air defense systems. That means that this is not just an intentional attempt at disinformation, but a conscious attempt to involve NATO, which is conducting a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine, to involve it into a direct conflict with our country. Now, the Russophobic authorities of Poland weren't very far off. From the very beginning, they unequivocally stated that they were the target of a Russian attack. The foreign ministry of this country summoned the Russian ambassador in the middle of the night to register their resolute protest. And this in spite of the fact that photos published in the social media in the wake of the event leave no doubt that it was Ukrainian air defense missiles that crossed into Poland. And now this has been confirmed even by NATO and overall in the West. If not for that, all these facts would be concealed from the public in order to promote the version of Russian guilt. However, it's very difficult to deny the obvious. Just as in the history of the missile strike by the Ukrainian armed forces against Kramatorsk on the 8th of April, which Ukraine tried to pass off as a Russian crime. However, photos of witnesses who happened to be there derailed this intentional and brutal provocation. Our former Western partners now don't like to remember that. And the Kiev regime has since then introduced punishment against all those who publish on social media materials that show consequences of any military strikes. This way, because Ukrainian citizens could involuntarily thwart the provocation of their authorities. Now, returning to this tragic incident, I cannot fail to mention that Ukrainian air defense systems have long had a bad reputation. At least since the moment when in October of 2001 over the Black Sea, during military exercises, a Russian civilian airliner was shot down, flying from Tel Aviv to Novosibirsk. 78 people died on board. Many recalled also the tragedy of that tragedy in 2014 when over the Donbass the Malaysian Boeing was shot down. The so-called international investigators, who included Ukraine, didn't even consider as a matter of principle the possibility of Ukraine's responsibility for that disaster. And over the past few months, we regularly see footage about the consequence of the Ukrainian air defense missiles falling on residential homes, which were used to conceal these systems. There are clumsy attempts to pass off these incidents as consequences of Russian strikes carried out with high-precision weapons against the military targets and critical infrastructure, while keeping silent that in case of a direct hit by such high-precision weapons, there would be nothing left of these homes. Distinguished colleagues, we have long ago stopped being surprised by your attempts in any circumstances, in spite of facts or common sense, to blame Russia for everything. And so today, in spite of clear evidence of the Ukrainian-Polish provocation, many representatives of Western countries have stated to the effect that even if the missiles were launched by Ukraine, it's still Russia who's to blame for destroying critical infrastructure. The lameness of this logic manifests itself in all its glory as it applies to the irresponsible shelling of Zaporozhye power plant. As everyone knows, Ukraine is behind that shelling. Some of you have repeated your favorite cunning mantra. If it weren't for Russia, we would not find ourselves in this situation. Well, I want to, for the umpteenth time, remind you, we would not find ourselves in this situation if not for the fact that in 2014 in Kiev, with the direct participation of a number of Western states, a bloody anti-constitutional coup had not taken place. And the leaders of that coup chose from the very first day the path of distorting history and driving out the use of the Russian language, and thus provoked an acute internal civilian conflict. And we would not be discussing today what we're discussing if you didn't abet the Kiev regime in its unwillingness to fulfill the Minsk agreements and didn't provide cover for its 8-year-long war against the inhabitants of the Donbass. In that case, we would not have had to begin the special military operation to protect the population of the Donbass. And if you had not interfered and did not supply Ukraine with weapons and ammunition, if you encouraged the Ukrainian leadership to strive for peace on realistic terms rather than fuel its feverish fantasies about the possibility of victory over Russia, for the sake of which the Zelensky regime is senselessly throwing tens of thousands of its soldiers into the meat grinder, if you reacted to the terrorist actions of the Ukrainian special forces against Russia, we would not be forced to conduct precision strikes on infrastructure. But since you're acting as you're acting, while the Kiev regime is taking credit for non-existent military prowess, we are forced to achieve the goals set for the special military operation by weakening the military potential of Ukraine, which was created first and foremost due to the unlimited supplies of Western weaponry. Now, we are used to the fact that Ukraine cannot be criticized. Any crimes by the Kiev regime are a priori ignored, or the blame is shifted to Russia. We are used to the disgusting fake material against Russia and its armed forces. I just want to ask you a rhetorical question. Has any one of you, for once, commented on the repression and brutality that the representatives on the Kiev regime have conducted on territory under its control against peaceful inhabitants? The kind of words they used to describe them and the kind of atrocities they subject it to. Now it's taking place in Kherson. Earlier, it took place in other cities. All this is available in the public domain. I will answer for you. No. All this is outside your scope of vision, outside of your horizon, and not within your selective conscience. So, when you criticize someone, look at yourselves in the mirror. And while you're at it, don't forget to remember how you arrogantly rejected the proposed discussion of issues of European security, clinging to the sacred right of NATO to expand without heeding the concerns of other countries. Mr. President, well, since we have gathered here, I want to recall the involvement of NATO countries in the Ukrainian conflict. They continue flooding Ukraine with weapons and sending teams of instructors and foreign mercenaries to work with those weapons. At the same time, the U.S. military has actively become involved in planning and de facto control over the conduct of military activities, which was recently officially recognized by the Pentagon. We have no doubt how Western military technology is used for targeted strikes against civilian facilities. Just over the past week, frequent artillery barrages have been fired, including using HIMARS multiple rocket launchers against the central and residential parts of Donetsk, Yasinovato, Stakhanovsk, Svatovo, and other cities, and even the cities of the Belgorod Oblast of Russia. And strikes continue to be conducted against the Kakhovska hydroelectric plant, which could lead to a major humanitarian disaster. We have no illusions why this is necessary for the West. For the West, Ukraine is inter alia a testing range to test various types of weapons, which was recently recognized by the Ukrainian Ministers of Defense Reznikov, who said that Ukraine has become the scene of a competition of different types of weapon systems. Mr. President, we are extremely surprised by the attempts of Western colleagues to take credit for the transport of Russian food and fertilizer through the World Food Program. The President of France, Macron, declared that supposedly the channels of supplies were established thanks to the efforts of France and the World Food Program, using the word we, and we similarly are hearing similar statements from Western statements. I'd like to know, who are we? Who? I just want to recall that we're talking about fertilizer that Western countries retained on their territory and that Russia proposed to transfer by itself to developing countries. And the West, in particular the European Union, not only did not assist this, but tried to prevent it. Now they're trying to claim all credit for it. I want to once again stress that it's Russian fertilizer that are being sent to Africa that were earlier retained in the European Union and frozen. And it was Russia itself that proposed to deliver this to developing countries. That is precisely what is taking place with the mediation of the World Food Program. And we're actually paying for this ourselves, for the transport. Mr. President, it would be naive to think that all the assistance provided by the West, all the military and financial support of Ukraine, is used as intended. We have provided quite a bit of evidence how a significant part of this weapon falls into the hands of terrorists and criminals fueling conflicts around the world, whereas a huge amount of the equipment is simply stolen. It appears that at last the countries that are supplying this so-called assistance have begun to give serious thought to this. On the 7th of November, a group of American experts was sent to Ukraine to verify the supplies of weapons to Kiev. It turns out the United States monitors just 1/10 of the part of those weapons, or 22,000 units. The fate of the rest of the weapons sent is unknown. At the same time, as a result of the bankruptcy of a major American cryptocurrency exchange, FTX, and the literal disappearance of billions of assets, there are very entertaining facts are emerging about the contacts of that exchange with the Ukrainian authorities. The founder and owner of that exchange happens to be one of the biggest donors of the U.S. Democratic Party, which is playing a key role in providing assistance to Kiev. Such machinations do not surprise us, but American taxpayers might be surprised to learn about them. Now, there are faint voices of reason that are beginning to be heard in the West, but they're drowned out by the aggressive chorus of those who are seeking by any means to prolong hostilities and to inflict a defeat on Russia with the help of Ukraine. The Secretary General of NATO, Stoltenberg, has stated that the alliance considers unacceptable any contacts which would be aimed at finding a solution that takes into account the positions and interests of Russia. Whereas the former special representative of the United States in Ukraine, Mr. Volker, in his article, conditioned normalizations of relations between West and Russia with a defeat, change of leadership, and a revision of our external borders. The responsibility for their transgressions, Western countries are trying to shift it on Russia, and they're using our organization, the United Nations, for their sordid ends. This was clearly demonstrated this past Monday on the 14th of November during the debates of the special session of the General Assembly. The Western initiators of a resolution on so-called reparations could not even provide a broad outline what kind of mechanism on compensation of damages to Ukraine they intend to create. Instead of that, they forced developing countries to simply sign on to a legally dubious, politicized text aimed at the illegal legalization of the expropriation of foreign assets. But this time, even the Western campaign of intimidation, coercion, and blackmail didn't work. The results of the vote, where over half of member states refused to support a new anti-Russian screed, speak for themselves. For most countries, including those who you forced to vote for this text, for those countries, the double standards of our Western colleagues are obvious. Their unwillingness to answer for their own crimes, slavery, colonialism, military invasions, blockades, and sanctions. For their attempts to replace international law with a rules-based order in which they themselves define the rules. The developing world once again could see for itself that the Ukrainian crisis is a mere political currency in the plans of the West, an instrument to punish undesirables, for submission of those who depend on it, and to retain global domination that is slipping away in the midst of an emerging multipolar world. Thank you very much.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Ghana. I thank USG Rosemary DiCarlo for her comprehensive briefing and assessment of the security and humanitarian situations in Ukraine. At the outset, I reaffirm Ghana's complete commitment to the sovereignty, political independence, and territorial integrity of Ukraine. We reiterate our support for all legitimate international efforts aimed at restoring Ukraine to a state of peace. Colleagues, the question of global food security is critical. During the last meeting of the Council on Ukraine, many delegations showed strong support for the continuity of the Black Sea Grain Initiative. We are pleased that the Russian Federation has since reconsidered the suspension of its participation in the initiative, which has so far recorded more than 10 million metric tons of grain shipment across the world. The active leadership of the Secretary General and those of the government of Turkey have been key to the effective operationalization of the initiative, and we remain supportive of their efforts in this regard. As the 120-day initiative draws to a close on 19th November, we count on the good faith commitments of all stakeholders for the timely renewal of the grain deal. The almost 100 million people who suffer from high levels of food insecurity is an unacceptable reality. We urge that their conditions should be at the forefront of discussions to ensure unhindered global food supplies and the adoption of pragmatic measures to address impediments to the export of Russian fertilizers and agro-products. We must prevent the further worsening of food insecurity in the coming months. On the deteriorating security and humanitarian situations, Ghana remains deeply concerned by the intensified missile and drone attacks in several cities of Ukraine, including renewed attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Lviv yesterday. The unrelenting assault on Ukraine's already battered energy infrastructure amidst the upcoming winter season threaten the livelihoods and lives of many civilians. Many homes, schools, and medical facilities also have no heating or access to potable water. Typical of all conflict situations, the women, children, and vulnerable persons, most of whom are either displaced or sheltering in bunkers, have become the worst victims of this war. The attacks on civilians and civilian infrastructure reveal the worst form of our common humanity and may constitute serious violations of international law. It departs from the accepted norms and the customary principles of conventional warfare codified in the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and the additional protocol relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflict. Ghana therefore reiterates its call on the parties to bring their forces in accord with international law, including international humanitarian law and human rights law. We are gravely alarmed by the emerging reports of possible war crimes in the city of Kherson, and maintain the principled position that such claims, including human rights violations and conflict-related sexual violence, be submitted to thorough, transparent, and independent investigations. The Security Council, together with the international community, must work collectively to avoid impunity in Ukraine and secure justice for all victims of the war. We note with satisfaction the ongoing humanitarian efforts, including the distribution of cash, food and non-food items, medical outreach, and water, sanitation, and hygiene services. In commending the United Nations humanitarian agencies and partners for the life-saving support provided since the beginning of the war, we also stress the need for such efforts to be guided by the fundamental principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. While welcoming the elevated humanitarian efforts, we deem it necessary to point out that humanitarian assistance only offers temporary relief and is insufficient to protect civilians from harm. Humanitarian assistance cannot substitute the requirement for a comprehensive and lasting resolution of the conflict. We therefore reiterate our call on the Russian Federation to immediately and unconditionally cease its aggression against Ukraine, consistent with the rules of international law and the purposes and principles of the United Nations Charter, and to seek a resolution of its concerns through diplomacy and dialogue. Yesterday's Polish missile incident and the experience of history reminds us of the risks that the continuation of this unnecessary war poses in its further spread. The scenes from the city of Kherson are telling signs of how much the people desire an end to the war, an end to the strife, and the beginning of a new chapter of peace, reconciliation, and reconstruction. The Council must therefore support all efforts for peace. I thank you. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Ukraine.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Distinguished members of the Security Council, Under Secretary General Di Carlo. I thank Under Secretary Rosemary Di Carlo for her briefing. I'm sure it is difficult, if not painful, to deliver such a tragic account of the situation on the ground. I'm also profoundly thankful to our friend and colleague, U.S. Permanent Representative Ambassador Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for sharing her personal experience of meeting some of the victims of Russian war crimes in Ukraine. We believe every member of this Council ought to visit Ukraine. You are all welcome, all but Russia, that must immediately leave Ukraine and stop this carnage and stop making a cannon fodder production line of its own people. I also recognize here the representative of the terrorist Russian regime in the permanent seat of the Soviet Union. What a mockery of peace efforts that terrorists are still at the table on an equal footing with 14 members of the Security Council, one day after the gravest attack on Ukraine's critical infrastructure. While temperatures in Ukraine start dropping below freezing, these terrorists aim to deprive Ukrainians of electricity, water, and heating. More than 90 missiles targeted energy facilities and other civilian infrastructure in and at least 11 regions of Ukraine. As a result, about 10 million Ukrainians throughout the country were affected by emergency blackouts. Ukraine expresses its solidarity with brotherly Polish people following yesterday's tragedy in the village of Przewódów, where 2 people were killed by missiles. We support a full and transparent investigation to establish all the facts of this tragic incident, and we are ready to cooperate with the Polish side to contribute to this investigation. At the same time, it is clear that the Russian war of aggression against Ukraine, with regular missile terror as one of its core elements, remains the only root cause of violence and human suffering in Ukraine and beyond. As soon as Russia is unable to continue its war, security in the region will immediately be restored. Now Ukraine defends itself from barbaric attacks by Russia that aim to deprive millions of people of access to their basic needs, and thus creating a humanitarian disaster that could spill over far beyond my country. We are grateful for the support of our friends, in particular Poland, in countering these attacks and bringing peace and security back to our region. Mr. President, Russia commits its nasty attacks against civilians because it is the only kind of revenge it can take for its regular military and diplomatic defeats. Last week, Ukraine restored its sovereignty over 4,500 square kilometers in Kherson and Mykolaiv region. Russian forces were kicked out of the only regional center they had been able to occupy since the beginning of the invasion. You might have seen the touching pictures of how the local people who spent 8 months under occupation and endured heavy suffering at the hands of the Russians greeted their liberators on the streets of Kherson and other deoccupied settlements. 8 months ago, when the Russian occupying forces entered Kherson, its residents were on the streets as well. The atmosphere was totally different, but there were some similarities with the joyful rallies in November. The Russian occupiers were also met with Ukrainian flags, the Ukrainian anthem, and the slogan, "Kherson is Ukraine." It is a matter of sadness that many did not live to see the deoccupation. Fleeing from the right bank of the Dnieper River, the Russian army left behind traces of the same atrocities that it committed in other regions. Investigators have already documented more than 400 Russian war crimes, and the bodies of both civilians and military personnel have been found. There is nothing for Russian diplomacy to boast about either. Perhaps accepting the sprinting skills that Putin's representative regularly develops by promptly fleeing from this chamber, and I appreciate that he is here today. Russian diplomacy did not and could not find any credible argument in response to the adoption by the General Assembly of the resolution for furtherance of remedy and reparation for aggression against Ukraine. We welcome this adoption, which is a clear message of hope for justice and an important first step towards accountability. President, recently we have heard a number of statements from the Russian side on negotiations and dialogue. One can hardly comment on the sincerity of these statements against the backdrop of 9 dozen missiles shelled on civilian infrastructure in one day. If there is no concrete action to restore peace, it means that Russia simply wants to deceive all of us again. Russia wants to buy time, build up its forces, and then launch another wave of aggression, terror, and global destabilization. We must not allow Russia to recharge. It is time to stop the war before the situation finally spirals in a menacing direction, unpredictable and uncontrolled. We must not allow Russia to recharge, as I said, but we also have to remember what President Zelensky outlined while addressing the G19 summit. Radiation and nuclear safety should be the first to be ensured. Russia must immediately withdraw all its militants from the territory of the Zaporizhzhia NPP. The station must be immediately transferred to the control of the International Atomic Energy Agency and the Ukrainian personnel. Second, food security should also be in the focus. Due to the strong participation of the UN, Turkey, and other partners, we have been able to improve food security globally. Since July, Ukraine has exported over 10 million tons of foodstuffs by sea. In order to increase our export by several million tons per month, Ukraine proposes to expand the grain export initiative to other ports, in particular, the port of Mykolaiv and Olvia in the Mykolaiv region. Ukraine has also launched the Grain from Ukraine initiative to support the most vulnerable. The first ship with 27,000 tons of wheat leaves for Ethiopia. Ethiopia that continues to vote against Ukraine. Nevertheless, we ship our grain to Ethiopia. Ukraine can export 45 million tons of foodstuff this year. Any country can join and contribute to ensuring the Ukrainian grain be supplied to those in need. And let a significant part of it be directed to those who suffer the most. Third is energy security. The Russian terror against Ukrainian energy infrastructure aims as well to prevent the export of our electricity to neighboring countries. While Russia is interested in energy crisis, we should all be interested in ending terror. I thank all our partners who have already helped Ukraine with the supply of air defense and missile defense systems. They work, but we need more to ensure full protection from Russian terrorists. We are ready to accept a mission of UN experts to the objects of critical energy infrastructure of Ukraine to assess the scale of damage and the needs for restoration, as well as to prevent their further destruction. The fourth critical step is the release of all prisoners and deportees. Thousands of our people, military and civilians, are in Russian captivity. They are subjected to brutal torture. Russia also continues to hold at least 11,000 children who have been forcibly deported to Russia. The only viable solution will be the release of prisoners on an all-for-all basis. Fifth, the principles of the UN Charter must be fully respected. Ukraine will not be ready to compromise its sovereignty and territorial integrity within its internationally recognized borders. Six, Russian troops must be withdrawn from the territory of Ukraine, and Ukraine's control over all sections of our state border with Russia must be restored. This will result in a real and complete cessation of hostilities. Seventh, justice should immediately come next. Everywhere, when we liberate our land, we see one thing: Russia leaves behind torture chambers and mass burials of murdered people. This was the case in Bucha and other cities in the north of the country after their occupation. This was the case in the Kharkiv region. The same we observe now in the Kherson region. Eighth is the need to immediately protect the environment. Millions of hectares of forest were burned by shelling. Almost 200,000 hectares of our land are contaminated with unexploded mines and shells. Dozens of coal mines are flooded. Therefore, at the climate change conference held recently in Egypt, Ukraine proposed to create a platform to assess the environmental damage of war. The ninth step is to prevent escalation. Ukraine requires effective security assurances, which should be an integral element of the post-war security architecture in the Euro-Atlantic space. These guarantees could be formalized in the Kyiv Security Compact. The draft of this document has been already elaborated by Ukraine. And the final step will be a confirmation of the end of the war, when all the anti-war measures are implemented, when security and justice begin to be restored. A document confirming the end of the war should be signed by the parties. President, it seems that since our meetings in October, Russia has leveled up in defining its enemies in this war. Last time, as you remember, there were more war mosquitoes and birds. As we found out recently, Russia now tries, I quote, to stop the supreme ruler of hell, whatever the name he uses, Satan, Lucifer, or Iblis. In this fight, Russian enemies are backed by Westerners who have, I quote, saliva running down their chins from degeneracy, end of quote. Who do you think these quotations belong to? An inebriated person? A narrow-minded fan of Nazi ideas of superior or degenerative nations? In fact, it belongs to the former Russian president, Mr. Medvedev, now Putin's deputy in the Russian Security Council. I wonder why the Russian delegation refrained from delivering this important update to the Council. Or perhaps we should prepare for another urgent Council meeting as soon as Russia finds those who could brief the Council on how to exercise demons. It would be a logical continuation of both the Russian attempts to discredit the Security Council and the process of internal moral degradation of the Kremlin. Unfortunately, these morbid reflections have led to the deaths of tens of thousands in the bloodiest war in Europe since the Second World War. Russia must be stopped, and due to the courage of the Ukrainian army, due to the commitment of the Ukrainian people, due to the international solidarity with Ukraine, Russia will be stopped. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Ukraine for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Poland.
Mr. President, allow me to start by providing the members of the Security Council with some additional details about yesterday's tragic event in Poland. On November 15, at around 3:30 p.m., during yet another wave of massive missile strikes by Russian forces against civilian critical infrastructure in the whole of Ukraine, including the immediate vicinity of the territory of Poland, 2 Polish citizens lost their lives in the Polish village of Przewodów, situated around 5 kilometers from the Polish-Ukrainian border. The apparent cause of their death was the explosion from the missile that fell on the location, which has no military background whatsoever. I would like to express our deepest gratitude for the gestures of solidarity also heard today that Poland keeps receiving from all over the world with regards to this tragic event. No matter what was the particular course of the events in Przewodów, that fatal afternoon, those innocent people would not have been killed if there had been no Russian war against Ukraine. Their only fault was the fact that they lived close to the civilian infrastructure on the Ukrainian side of the border that Russia keeps attacking as military targets. Mr. President, yesterday's sad events teaches us how close we actually live to a potential escalation and the spillover of the Russian war war of aggression of far-reaching consequences that we all can foresee. Bearing that in mind, Poland decided to act with full restraint and responsibility. We immediately launched an extensive, multifaceted investigation aimed at explaining all the details of the incident. The very initial findings support the hypothesis that the event was not a deliberate attack, but naturally we need to wait for the final conclusion until the investigation is over. Poland is also conducting the intensive consultations on the incident with its NATO allies and the key partners. A decision had to also be made to increase the combat readiness of the selected units of the Polish armed forces, with particular emphasis on airspace monitoring. We wish to assure the whole international community about the transparency of the ongoing investigation and about the guarantees of collective security which Poland will keep providing to the region, both as an individual country and as a part of the NATO, which remains the defensive alliance. We understand our responsibilities that lies in and that's why Poland is and will remain a regional stronghold of peace, security and stability. Mr. President, it is clear that it is Russia which is to blame for menacing the world with the war of aggression and its spillover effects, including yesterday's tragic incident in Poland. The launching of yesterday's missile attacks against Ukraine, the fiercest since the beginning of the war, required significant military preparations. Despite recent setbacks on the battlefield, Moscow clearly did not change its goals. It still wants to erase sovereign Ukraine from the map and cause innocent people to suffer. This evidently shows Russia's absolute lack of will to embark on the path leading to a resolution of the conflict that it has created. Russia pretends to be ready for talks, but in reality it's carrying its barbaric attacks against the civilian population and energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Distinguished member of the Security Council, the current situation will not change our approach. Poland believes it is crucial to continue the support for Ukraine. Poland has done so since the very beginning of the war. We approach it in the multidimensional way by providing aid both in Ukraine as well as within our own territory. We will continue on this path. Total estimated value of the Polish aid given in 2022 to Ukrainian refugees, both by individuals as well as the local and state authorities, amounts to over $5.5 billion, circa 1% of the Polish GDP. According to the OECD estimates in 2022, Poland will spend for humanitarian and military assistance the total of $8.5 billion. It's almost 1.5% of the Polish GDP, becoming one of the major donors to Ukraine. As we heard today, currently, the most urgent humanitarian issue that we'll need to focus is on the upcoming winter. Due to the Russian bombings, over 3.5 million people are left without a roof over their head. The priority is to create shelter for those people. The Russian forces continuously attack the Ukrainian energy infrastructure in a deliberate attempt to aggravate the humanitarian crisis. Their goal is probably also to cause another wave of refugees, which is calculated to destabilize the situation in the countries to which they arrive, including Poland. Mr. President, Russian imperialism needs to be treated as the thing it really is, a global threat with far-reaching consequences. This global threat needs to be neutralized before it plunges into the whole world further into chaos. This war needs to end with a just peace, the just peace. It needs to end on terms which are acceptable for Ukraine. The aggressor cannot benefit from its aggression. Instead, we need accountability for what atrocities and damages it is inflicted. Therefore, Poland welcomes the last week's General Assembly resolution on the creation of the Registry of Damages mechanism. We see it as a first step in the right direction. In conclusion, we once again call on all states which stands on the side of international law to take all necessary steps to persuade Russia to stop its aggression and to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. It is the only way to prevent further deaths, injuries and devastations. This is the only way to stop escalation of this large-scale humanitarian and human rights crisis that continues to bring away lives of innocent civilians. And I thank you.
I thank the representative of Poland for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Estonia.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, I'm speaking on behalf of the three Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and my own country, Estonia. We thank the Undersecretary General Rosmi De Carlo for her most valuable briefing. Allow me to start by commending the immense bravery of the Ukrainian Defense Forces that last Friday, after months of Russian occupation, took back control of Kherson. There is no doubt that sooner or later, Ukraine will liberate all the occupied territories within its internationally recognized borders. These territories are Ukraine, and Ukraine has every right to defend them in full accordance with Article 51 of the Charter. We are steadfast in supporting Ukraine's efforts for as long as it takes, and will continue providing strong political, military, and financial support to Ukraine. Russian missiles hitting critical infrastructure and residential buildings in Kiev and in a number of other Ukrainian cities yesterday once again prove that Russia is not interested in peace. During the heaviest wave of missile strikes against Ukraine since February, 2 Polish citizens lost their lives in an explosion that took place in the east of Poland. Allow me to extend my deepest condolences to the families of all those who lost tragically their lives due to this barbaric attack. Notwithstanding ongoing investigations, it is clear that Russia alone bears the responsibility for the explosion as it continues its illegal war against Ukraine. We commend the swift actions by the UN humanitarian agencies led by the humanitarian coordinator, Dennis Brown, to bring humanitarian aid to Kherson on Monday for the first time since the Russian forces took control of Kherson. As in other liberated areas, the Russian army left Kherson with a trail of atrocity crimes. The city was left without water, heat, electricity, and communications. We urge Russia to give access to humanitarian organizations to areas currently under their occupation so that necessary emergency assistance can reach all those in need in Ukraine. The winter is approaching fast in Ukraine, with the temperatures expected to fall well below freezing point. By using missiles and Iranian-supplied drones, Russia's deliberate strikes against Ukraine's energy facilities have left by now 7 million people without electricity. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania are continuing to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine to address the needs worsened by the winter and the Russian attacks against Ukrainian infrastructure, as well as demining assistance. We also urge Russia to give access to the UN representatives and the ICRC to the places of detention of civilians and prisoners of war, and ensure access of a UN fact-finding mission to Alenivka. The deportation of Ukrainian children to Russia is a war crime. Children belong to their families and loved ones, and they must be safely and immediately returned to their homes. Mr. President, the Russian unprovoked and brutal war of aggression against Ukraine has triggered issues of deep global concern. Due to Russia's blockade of Ukrainian seaports and the destruction of necessary infrastructure, Russia has caused a global food crisis and essentially weaponized food and hunger as means of hybrid warfare. The Black Sea Grain Initiative, alongside the EU-led Solidarity Lanes, has therefore been instrumental in stabilizing the global food market and providing food to millions of people in Africa, Asia, and Europe. Russia's statements claiming that Ukrainian grain is reaching only European countries and that its own grain and fertilizers shipments are prohibited by Western sanctions are fake, as we have heard the UN officials attest also in this Council. We praise the UN Secretary General and Turkey for all the efforts to renew the grain deal, and we urge Russia to agree to the renewal of the initiative beyond November 19 and implement it in good faith. We strongly condemn Russia's irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and its cynical accusations against Ukraine of creating a dirty bomb. These accusations have been clearly and unequivocally refuted by the International Atomic Energy Agency. We urge Russia to immediately withdraw all of its troops and military equipment from the premises of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant that Russia illegally controls and stop its nuclear blackmail. Finally, it is critical that all evidence of crimes and violations of human rights and international humanitarian law committed in Ukraine continue to be gathered in a manner that will hold up in independent, impartial judicial institutions. We are determined to ensure that all those responsible for war or other atrocity crimes must be held to account. But as has been said, the most responsible people are those who decided to wage this illegal war against Ukraine. The aggressor cannot go unpunished, or others will follow its lead. We therefore call for establishing a special tribunal to fill the current jurisdictional loophole and bring the Russia's top political and military leadership to justice for committing the crime of aggression against Ukraine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Estonia for their statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Olof Skog, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the United Nations.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, for convening us, and thank you for the opportunity to address the Council this afternoon. And thank you to Rosemary DiCarlo for a very comprehensive briefing. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, and I would like to highlight the following 3 points. One, the importance of upholding international humanitarian law. Secondly, on accountability for crimes committed in Ukraine. And thirdly, on the global consequences of Russia's war of aggression. First, Mr. President, on international humanitarian law. During the past weeks, Russia has stepped up its targeted strikes against Ukraine's civilians and civilian infrastructure. Yesterday saw the largest and gravest missile attack since the start of the invasion. We express our condolences to the families of the victims in both Ukraine and in Poland. By deliberately disrupting energy and water supply, Russia is trying to paralyze Ukraine and sow despair within the population as winter approaches. These unacceptable actions targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure by Russia are unlawful, and they constitute war crimes. The IMF estimates that Ukraine may need $4 billion a month just to keep the lights on and the taps running. We cannot leave the Ukrainian people in such a situation. The EU is therefore undertaking urgent rehabilitation measures to prepare for winter and repair the energy infrastructure bombed by Russia. We are also working on a package to ensure Ukraine's macroeconomic stability, maintaining essential public services and rebuild critical infrastructure. I also reiterate the need for full humanitarian access, including in areas not currently under the Ukrainian government's control. My second point, Mr. Chairman, concerns accountability. The images from the liberation of Kherson bring both joy and dread. Joy, as the population welcome its liberators after 8 months of brutal occupation. Dread, as stories and evidence of cruelty and war crimes surface, as they did in Bucha, Izium, and elsewhere. It is of paramount importance to continue documenting all evidence of war crimes committed throughout Ukraine. We rely on the International Criminal Court and on the Ukrainian authorities to bring perpetrators to account. We acknowledge Ukraine's efforts to secure accountability, including for the crime of aggression. We are accordingly examining the feasibility of various options in order to see how full accountability can be ensured in an optimal way. Monday's resolution by the General Assembly to recommend the creation of a register of damages and recognizing the need for reparation of damage is another important step to ensure accountability. All victims of Russia's aggression deserve justice and reparation. The EU will continue to support Ukraine in the framework of the ICJ proceedings, and we also highlight the important work of the Commission of Inquiry established by the Human Rights Council in this regard. Thirdly, Mr. President, on the global consequences. By weaponizing food in its war against Ukraine, Russia is solely responsible for the escalating global food security crisis. The EU is at the forefront of global efforts to address food insecurity, which is affecting millions of vulnerable people, especially in developing countries. We reiterate our strong support to all efforts to extend the UN-brokered Black Sea Grain Initiative and to scale up operations for the delivery of much-needed grain and other foodstuffs. We commend the work of the UN Secretary General and the Joint Coordination Center in Istanbul in this regard. According to UN data, 2/3 of the wheat exported from Ukraine through the Black Sea Grain Initiative has gone to developing countries. In addition to export overseas, through the EU-Ukraine solidarity lanes, 15 million tons of agricultural goods have been exported from Ukraine to global markets over land. To address capacity constraints and further facilitate export from Ukraine, the EU has mobilized an additional 250 million euros. In parallel, the EU is stepping up global food assistance. Earlier this week, a new humanitarian aid package of 210 million euros for 15 countries was announced, bringing the EU's overall food security support up to 8 billion euros between 2021 and 2024. We call on others to follow suit and step up their humanitarian assistance to the most vulnerable too. And I wanted to express here my appreciation and of the solidarity and some very good humanitarian gestures that have been announced by several members of this council, including some from very far away. Mr. President, President Zelensky stated earlier this week that his country is ready for peace. The EU supports all genuine and meaningful efforts to this end in full respect of international law, including Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We note, however, that Russia has not shown any indications it is engaging in serious and sincere diplomatic efforts. On the contrary, it has stepped up its missile attacks on civilian infrastructure. The EU will continue to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes, and we continue to urge Russia to immediately cease all hostilities and unconditionally withdraw all its forces and military equipment from the entire territory of Ukraine within its internationally recognized borders. The war would end tomorrow if Russia withdraws as requested by the General Assembly. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Skok for his statement. And now give the floor to the representative of Slovakia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Slovakia aligns itself with the statement delivered by the distinguished representatives of the European Union. Mr. President, we are approaching 9 months since the beginning of the unprovoked and unjustified Russian military aggression against Ukraine in violations of all fundamental values and principles of the UN Charter and international law. Despite many calls of the international community, the Russian Federation remains silent and continues to justify its so-called special military operation under false pretext based on spreading disinformation and propaganda, which we strongly condemn. How can the Russian Federation continue to persuade us that its action is justifiable under international law? We have heard in last months in this very room from the Russian representatives how Ukrainian civilians were happy to see the Russian army allegedly liberating them from the Kiev influence. But recent pictures and videos of civilians greeting Ukrainian brave soldiers fighting for the future of their country with open arms in the newly liberated city of Kherson prove the exact opposite and only confirm that the Russian Federation has tried to persuade us about its kingdom of crooked mirrors perception. Slovakia remains to be gravely concerned about the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, which unfortunately progressively further deteriorates. We remain appalled by the huge numbers of killings of innocent civilians, attacks on critical infrastructure, as well as the huge scale of sexual and gender-based violence committed by Russian soldiers and occupants. We deplore in the strongest terms yesterday's Russian missile attacks across Ukraine, plunging 7 million homes into darkness. Mr. President, how can we expect that the Russian Federation adheres to the international law, humanitarian law including, and protects innocent civilians in time of war when it ignores to guarantee fundamental rights of its own citizens? We were horrified by the video with the execution of a former Russian prison inmate by a sledgehammer. Such an action is nothing else but arbitrary killing and multiple violation of human rights, including the right to life, and the proof that the human rights are for the Russian Federation nothing but a concept which it is deliberately ignoring. Mr. President, we would also like to reiterate our concerns over the serious effects of the Russian invasion on global food security. As a result, millions of people around the world are being pushed into extreme poverty, hunger, and lack of access to food. As the Black Sea Grain Initiative is about to expire, we strongly support its extension. Last but not least, Slovakia urges the Russian Federation to listen finally to the voice of the United Nations and implement all respective resolutions, including the resolution of the General Assembly adopted this Monday. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovakia for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. The meeting is adjourned.